Wet wool steamed beside the stove. Ceiling wax cracked under the probate clerk's thumb. Three people sat on one side of the table and one sat on the other, and the silence between them had the weight of something that had already been decided before anyone arrived. The clerk set a deed on the pine surface. The eldest brother pushed it across the table with two fingers, the way a man slides a losing card toward the discard pile, and said to the clerk, not to his sister, "You will need a second paper for when she gives it back." 4 days earlier, Dexter Satterlee's wagon had overturned on frozen ground 2 miles south of the ranch gate. The horse dragged the wreck 40 yards before the harness snapped. By the time Lowell found him, Dexter's neck was broken and the cold had already begun settling into his hands. The will was read in the ranch dining room while wet wool steamed beside the stove and sealing wax cracked under the probate clerk's thumb. Merritt received the cattle, the hay barn, the main house, the horses, the outbuildings, and 1,100 acres of winter brown pasture. Lowell received the eastern allotment, 160 acres of timber slope, and a share of the spring. Ione received 7 acres of rocky ground and a 12 by 14-foot line shack that had stood empty for 3 years beneath a shoulder of anthracite mesa. The probate clerk, a narrow man named Amzie Bell, set the deed in front of her. Merritt pushed it across the table with 2 fingers, the way a man slides a losing card toward the discard pile. "You will need a second paper," Merritt said to Amzie, "for when she gives it back." Ione picked up the deed. The ink was dry. The room was not. She had $9.40, 2 wool blankets, 1 iron pry bar, an axe with a shortened handle, a grain shovel, a small sewing box with needles, thread, and a bone-handled awl. No horse, no standing timber on her parcel. No stored food beyond what she carried in a canvas sack, and a left wrist that had never healed properly after a fall 2 winters ago. A dull ache that sharpened whenever she gripped anything heavier than a water pail. The shack sat 6 wagon miles northwest of Crested Butte, up the Slate River Road, and then off it, against a low south-facing ridge where the wind came down from the mesa like something with weight. At nearly 9,000 feet, winter did not negotiate. It arrived, and whatever was not ready became its property. Leander Phelps, the county road overseer, rode out with Amzie Bell the following morning to inspect the parcel. The inspection was a legal formality. The verdict was not. Leander was 62 years old, built like a fence post that had survived 30 seasons, and he understood conventional winter survival the way a carpenter understands a plumb line. He had buried neighbors. He had pulled frozen cattle from drifts that swallowed them to the spine. He carried no malice toward Ione, but he carried no patience for what he saw. He kicked the empty wood rack first. The sound was flat and final. No fuel. He walked the east wall and put 3 fingers through a gap where the chinking had crumbled out. Wind moved through the hole and touched the back of Ione's neck from 6 feet away. Half a wall. He crouched beside the fireplace and looked up. A clay joint had separated in the chimney throat, and the flue liner showed a crack wide enough to catch a spark and hold it against dry timber. And a flue that may kill you before the cold does. He stood, brushed his knees, and faced her as though delivering a medical opinion to someone who had already been told the disease was terminal but had not yet understood the word. "Miss Satterlee, an exposed cabin at this altitude requires 6 cords of split, seasoned firewood to survive from November through April. You have no firewood. You have no access to timber on your parcel. Your brother has stated that you may not cut on ranch land. Even if you had standing trees, one person cannot fell, drag, buck, split, and season 6 cords in 17 days. One person cannot do it in 30. He looked at the roof, where newer pegs held boards that did not match the rest. That room will freeze before the ink on your deed dries. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man says the river is rising. He said it as a measured observation about physics, timber, altitude, and time, and every word of it was correct, given what he knew. Ione stood in the center of the room after Leander and Amzie rode out. The shack smelled of damp wood and mouse nests, and the faint mineral bite of stone dust. 12 feet by 14 feet, 7-foot ceiling, one door, swollen in its frame, no glazed window, a fireplace with a throat that could burn the building down, a floor of packed earth covered by split planks that had warped away from each other, leaving dark seams where cold air rose as though the ground itself were breathing. 17 days until Leander expected lasting snow. Boarding in Crested Butte would eat through $9 in weeks. There were no relatives willing to take her, no fare to leave Colorado, and if she left the parcel unoccupied, Merritt would file an abandonment claim before the first heavy frost. She could not stay. She could not leave. She could not heat what she could not fuel. She noticed, without yet understanding, that the shack was neglected but not uniformly ruined. The roof over the hearth had newer pegs, as Leander had observed, but those pegs were set with a precision the original builder had not used. 2 foundation stones near the fireplace bore chisel marks unlike the rest, narrow, angled, deliberate, as though someone had fitted them after the walls went up. The hearth flagstones were unusually wide and appeared to have been reset with a pale clay that did not match the mortar elsewhere in the room. She filed these details the way she filed everything, silently, without conclusion, against the possibility that they would matter later. That evening, Merritt arrived with Lowell in a wagon. The offer was simple. Merritt would take back the 7-acre parcel. In exchange, Ione could sleep in the hired women's room at the main ranch until spring. No ownership, no wages, a bed and meals for 5 months, after which she would need to find work in town or marry someone willing to support her. "It is a generous offer," Merritt said, standing in the doorway of the shack as though entering it would contaminate him. "More generous than you will get from anyone else." Ione looked at the deed in her hand. She looked at the room behind her. She looked at Merritt. No. Merritt's jaw worked once, as though he were chewing something he had not expected to taste. Then he walked to the fireplace and unhooked an iron cooking crane from its bracket. "This belongs to the ranch estate," he said. "Everything not permanently affixed reverts." Ione said nothing. The crane was worth perhaps $1. Its removal was not about the iron. It was about demonstrating what Merritt could take whenever he chose. "You cannot cut timber on ranch land," Merritt added from the wagon. "If I find stumps, I will send the sheriff." Lowell sat on the wagon seat and looked at the ground. He did not speak. He did not look at Ione. He held the reins and waited for his brother to finish. They drove away. Ione spent her first night without a fire. She wrapped both blankets around her body and placed her boots beneath her head so the leather would not freeze rigid. Frost formed on the inside of the roof boards from her breath, small crystals catching the last gray light through the chinking gaps, and for a while the ceiling looked like a sky she could almost reach. Sometime before dawn, the iron pry bar slipped from the blanket where she had tucked it for warmth. It struck the floor beside the hearth with a sound she expected, the flat clang of iron on stone, followed by a sound she did not, a low, hollow resonance, not the dead thud of solid earth beneath the planks. Something underneath the hearthstone answered the impact the way a drum answers a fist. She lay still and listened to her own pulse. Dawn came gray and windless. Frost still lined the ceiling. Ione's breath hung in the air like something she could hold. She pulled the pry bar free from where it had wedged against the hearthstone and struck the floor deliberately. Solid. She struck the stone beside the fireplace. Solid. She struck the wide flagstone directly in front of the hearth, the one with the pale clay, the one that did not match, and the hollow sound came back. She knelt and ran her fingers along the flagstone's edge. The clay seal was precise, not careless. Someone had laid this stone to be found by someone who knew to look. She worked the pry bar into the seam. The pale clay cracked cleanly, as though it had been mixed to hold against weather but yield to iron. The flagstone shifted. Beneath its near edge, she felt compacted sand, dry and cold and deliberate. She brushed the sand with her fingers and found a square iron lifting ring, black with age, bolted not to the stone above but to something below. A fitted wooden trapdoor, 18 inches wide, set flush with the floor joists and bearing 3 parallel notch marks cut into the wood with a chisel. Ione stopped breathing. Martha Satterlee had cut 3 notch marks into the pantry shelves every autumn. 3 marks meant winter reserves. 3 marks meant counted, weighed, measured, and set aside against the season, when counting was the difference between survival and prayer. Martha had been dead for 3 years. She had died of fever in the spring of 1883, when Ione was 18, and still believed that the ranch would always be the ranch and that a family was a structure as permanent as a stone wall. Ione's hand shook, but not from the cold. She looped a length of harness leather through the ring and pulled. The trapdoor rose on wooden hinges that had been greased with tallow and still moved. Below the opening, a stone stair descended 6 feet into darkness. Ione lowered her lamp. The underground space was not large, but it was not accidental. It had been built by someone who understood what cold could do and had decided to answer it with preparation rather than hope. A 3 by 6 foot access bay led to a 6 by 8 foot coal bin enclosed by 4-foot stone sidewalls. The bin floor was raised on slats above a shallow drainage sump lined with gravel. Sand-packed channels ran along the perimeter, directing any seepage away from the contents. A low air passage, no wider than a man's forearm, led toward the exterior foundation, ventilation for the space below, invisible from outside. And in the bin, stacked almost to the top of the partition wall, lay angular black stone, not the soft, crumbling lignite that broke apart in your hands, not the dusty brown coal that smoked and spat and left a room smelling like a railroad cut. This was hard, glossy, dense material that rang when 2 pieces struck together, a clean, almost metallic sound, like a hammer on an anvil heard from the next room. Anthracite. The bin wall bore 6 vertical marks, each representing 1,000 pounds. Beside them, Martha had scored smaller daily marks divided into 3 groups. Ione could not yet read the system, but she could count. 6,000 pounds, 3 tons of hard coal, hidden beneath a hearthstone in a shack that everyone including Ione, had believed was empty. Ione climbed back up the stone stair and sat on the cabin floor with the trapdoor open beside her. Cold air rose from below, carrying the faint mineral smell of clean coal. Outside, the wind had picked up. A branch scraped the north wall. Somewhere down the valley, a cow bellowed and received no answer. Martha Parfit Satterlee had been the daughter of a Pennsylvania mine carpenter. She had grown up around anthracite the way ranch children grew up around hay, as a material so common it became invisible. She had married Dexter and moved to Colorado and managed the ranch's winter accounts, and understood, with the precision of a woman who kept every figure in ink, how quickly the main house consumed firewood. She had known what Dexter's will would do before Dexter wrote it. She had known which child would receive the land and which would receive the scrap, and she had spent 3 summers converting an abandoned shack into a fuel vault. But knowing that Martha had hidden coal was not the same as knowing how to survive on it. 3 tons sounded enormous. It was not. Anthracite burned slowly. Yes, but it burned. 6,000 pounds divided by 32 pounds per day was 187 days. Divided by 48 pounds per day, the rate for deep cold or more than one occupant, it was 125 days. Winter in the upper Slate River country lasted 5 months at minimum. The margin between survival and exhaustion was measured in pounds per day, and every pound removed from the vault shortened what remained. The coal could not save her in a building that bled heat through every crack. It could not save her without a stove designed to burn it. It could not save her if the chimney caught fire or the flue filled with gas she could not smell. Martha had left a foundation. Ione had to build the rest. She remembered then, not all at once, but in fragments that arrived the way cold arrives, slowly, then everywhere. A visit to Crested Butte when Ione was 14. Martha tending a coal stove in a miner's boarding room. The stove had a grate at the bottom and a loading door at the top and a small chain that operated the lower draft. Martha had told her, in the same voice she used for measuring flour, that hard coal could smother beneath its own ash or release a gas that would put you down before you knew what was wrong. "It answers to air, not haste," Martha had said. "Feed the draft, not the fire." The memory was incomplete. It offered no blueprint, but it offered a principle, and the principle was this: do not try to heat the entire ranch. Reduce the space, seal the walls, use a compact fuel in a stove designed for under-fire draft, measure every pound, waste nothing. Inside a tin coal measure wedged behind the bin partition, Ione found a folded paper in Martha's handwriting. The ink had faded but remained legible. "Count the room before you count the winner. Air below. Ash clear, pipe open. Waste nothing." Beneath the note lay a bent stove key, a length of fine chain for operating a draft control, a slate showing 3 coal sizes marked with different hatch patterns, a charcoal sketch of a stove base and flue connection, and an unfinished consumption ledger with columns for date, pounds, hours, and wind. Martha had not left instructions. She had left materials for someone capable of building the instructions from evidence. The trapdoor was open. The question was whether Ione could turn what lay below it into a system that would keep her alive. Mina Heskett saw the lamp. She had been walking the road below the shack at dusk, checking a fence post that the freeze-thaw cycle had loosened, and she saw a light moving beneath the floor, a glow that appeared and disappeared as though someone were carrying a lantern through a space that should not have existed. Mina was 27, widowed, and the most capable person Ione knew who was not also trying to take something from her. She ran a small dairy operation 2 miles down the valley on 40 acres of leased land, and she survived each winter through a combination of relentless preparation and the kind of arithmetic that left no room for sentiment. She arrived at the shack with a hand on the door frame and a question that was not a greeting. "Why is there light beneath your floor?" Ione showed her. Mina descended the stone stair and stood in the coal bin and touched the anthracite with the back of her hand, the way you test a stove to see if it will burn you. She counted the tally marks on the wall. She examined the drainage sump and the sand channels and the ventilation passage. "Your mother did this," Mina said. It was not a question. Yes, she did not tell you. She could not know who would find the will first. If my father or Merritt had discovered this, they would have moved the coal to the ranch and sealed the hatch. Mina climbed back up and sat on the cabin floor across from Ione. Between them lay the open trap door, breathing cold mineral air into a room that smelled like mouse nests and rot. 3 tons is more than I expected to find in a hole, Mina said. But a hole full of coal is not a heated cabin. She raised 3 fingers. First, you do not own a coal stove. Anthracite will not burn in an open fireplace. You need a cast iron stove with a grate that admits air beneath the fuel bed, a loading door, an ash clean-out, and a sound chimney connection. Without the correct stove, that coal is a pile of black rock. She lowered 1 finger. Second, anthracite is difficult to light. It requires kindling, then softer coal, then gradual layering. If you smother it or rush it, it goes out. If you starve it of air, it produces a gas that has no color and no smell and will put you on the floor before you understand what is happening. She lowered another finger. Third, you're talking about sealing this cabin against drafts. Every crack you close is a crack that no longer brings air to your lungs. A wood fire warns you with smoke. Bad coal air can put you down before you know what is wrong. Ione did not argue. She did not defend the plan. She said, "You are right about all 3. Mina looked at her for a long moment. That is not the answer I expected. Would the wrong answer have been better? Something shifted in Mina's expression. Not confidence, not warmth. Recognition, perhaps, that Ione had listened to the problem rather than defending against it. There is a damaged coal stove behind Olson's boarding house, Mina said. He replaced it last spring. I do not know what he wants for it. It was not an offer of help. It was a piece of information given freely, and Ione received it as such. Olson wanted $6 for the stove. It was a Rathbone base burner with a cracked grate, a warped ash door, broken refractory clay lining the fire pot, and a chip out of the loading door hinge. 2 of its 4 legs were sound. The mica window in its side was gone, replaced by a tin patch riveted over the opening. It weighed nearly 200 pounds. Ione had $5.40 after paying Amzibel's filing fee. She offered Olson $4 cash, the iron cooking crane Merritt had overlooked when stripping the shack, and 2 weeks of mending boarding house linens. Olson rubbed his jaw. The crane is worth $1. The mending is worth 2 weeks I do not have to pay Mrs. Drake. You have a deal if you move it yourself. Moving a 200-pound stove without a horse required Mina's handcart, borrowed against a promise of labor that Ione could not yet define. Mina and Ione loaded the stove onto the cart in the alley behind the boarding house while 2 freighters watched from the loading dock with expressions that fell somewhere between amusement and concern. The 6-mile road to the shack climbed 800 feet. The handcart's wheels caught on every frozen rut. Ione's wrist began aching at the 2nd mile and was swelling by the 4th. Mina walked ahead, kicking stones from the wheel path, and did not offer to take Ione's side of the handle. By the time the stove sat on the cabin floor, Ione's arms were shaking. Her left wrist had puffed to twice its normal size, and the light was gone from the sky. You owe me for the cart, Mina said from the doorway. I know. And you have $5.40 less than before. $1.40. Mina looked at the stove. She looked at the open trap door. She looked at Ione. Do not die doing this, she said, and walked down the road toward her own cold house. Ione sat alone with a broken stove, a hidden coal vault, an incomplete set of instructions from a dead woman, and $1.40. The boarding house owner had already mentioned Ione's stove purchase. By evening, the story moving through Crested Butte held that Dexter Satterlee's youngest daughter planned to heat a roofless shack with rocks dug from a hole in the floor. The mockery was not cartoonish. Miners knew that anthracite burned, but they also knew it took skill and equipment that Ione visibly did not possess. Ranch families understood that underground storage could flood during spring thaw, leaving a woman with 3 tons of wet, useless stone. Teamsters questioned how anyone would move 6,000 pounds of coal through an 18-inch hatch without a hoist. And several people correctly warned that a cracked chimney in a sealed room was a method of suicide that did not require intent. Merritt came with a wagon 3 days after the stove arrived. He brought Lowell and a document he had written himself, claiming that any coal stored on the property before Dexter's death constituted estate inventory and should be transferred to the ranch. Ione produced the deed. The parcel transferred in Amzie Bell's careful legal phrasing with all permanent improvements, cellars, contents below grade, and fixtures. Amzie, contacted by letter, confirmed that the language favored Ione. The coal was below grade. The vault was a permanent improvement. The contents were hers. Merritt read the deed twice. His face did not change, but a vein in his temple rose and stayed. "That vault is unsafe," he said. "The timbers are old. The drainage is unproven. One spring flood fills it, and you have 3 tons of wet rock dissolving your foundation. I will ask the county to condemn the shack." Ione said nothing. Merritt leaned closer. "You cannot hold 7 acres merely to prove you can. The deed says I can hold them because they are mine." Merritt walked to the cabin's north side, where a bucket of water sat beside the door. He picked it up and poured it deliberately across the floor, directing the flow toward the open trap door. Lowell stepped forward. "Merritt, the water will find the coal," Merritt said. "By morning she will understand what damp does to a winter fuel supply." He climbed onto the wagon. Lowell followed, slower, his face carrying something Merritt's did not. They drove away. Ione watched the water spread across the uneven planks. It reached the trap door edge and spilled over. Below, the water ran down the stone stair and met Martha's perimeter drain, a channel of gravel and sand that directed moisture along the base of the walls and into the sump at the lowest point, away from the bin. The coal remained dry. The sabotage confirmed a design Ione had not yet tested. She sat on the edge of the trap door and looked down at the water moving obediently through a channel her mother had built 3 years before Ione knew it existed. The next morning, Merritt's ranch hands received a message. Anyone who helped Ione Satterlee with labor, materials, or transport would lose their winter position. Lowell avoided her when their paths crossed in town. The general store refused her credit because she owned no productive livestock, no milk cow, no poultry, and no collateral beyond 7 acres of rock and a piece of paper. Mina offered food. Ione accepted only a small sack of beans for which she traded 4 hours of mending. She would not take charity. Charity was debt with no terms, and Ione had learned from Martha that unnamed debts were the kind that consumed you. She took the stove apart on the cabin floor. Each piece went onto a wool blanket laid flat: grate bars, ash pan, fire pot, loading door, draft chain, chimney collar, the 4 legs with their bolts, the warped ash door, the cracked grate section, the broken refractory pieces. She arranged them the way Martha had arranged pantry stores, by function, by condition, by what was needed and what was missing. The grate was cracked through 1 bar. The ash door hung crooked on a bent hinge pin. The firepot lining was broken in 3 places, exposing the iron shell. The chimney collar was sound, but the threads on its adjustment bolt were stripped. She could see what was wrong. She could name it. She could hold each damaged piece in her hands and understand its purpose. What she could not do was fix it. The winter problem had become a mechanical problem, and the mechanical problem required skills she did not have and tools she could not buy. 13 days remained before Leander's predicted lasting snow. The wind outside carried a smell like iron, the smell of cold that has not yet arrived but is no longer far away. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by someone who could not yet see what you were building? Ione sat with the disassembled stove and stared at the pieces and waited for an idea that did not come. Somewhere down the valley, Mina's cow lowed for evening milking. The light through the chinking gaps turned orange, and then gray, and then black. 12 days now. Jenkin Treherne did not come to help. He came to deliver a repaired coal screen to Mina's shed, and he saw the stove parts laid out on the blanket through the open cabin door. He was 58 years old, Welsh-born, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he spent his life shaping. He had built ventilation doors, timber supports, stove bases, flue linings, and coal bin frames for mining camps across Gunnison County. His back was stiff from decades underground, and his left leg dragged slightly from a rock fall that had pinned him for 2 hours in a shaft near Irwin. He had also lost his younger brother, Cadell, in the Jokerville mine explosion 4 years earlier. 59 men had died when accumulated gas ignited in the tunnels outside Crested Butte. Jenkin had not been on shift that day. He had been repairing a door frame at the surface and felt the ground move beneath his boots and understood what the sound meant before the smoke reached daylight. He did not talk about the explosion. He talked about ventilation, draft, gas, and the cost of assuming that a space was safe because it had been safe yesterday. He stood in Ione's doorway and looked at the stove parts on the blanket. He looked at the open trap door. He looked at Ione. Whose work is that below? My mother's. Your mother was Martha Parfit. Yes. Parfit is a name I knew in the Pennsylvania camps. Her father built bin doors. Ione said nothing. She had not known that. Jenkin did not enter the cabin. He stood in the frame and tested her instead, the way a foreman tests a new hand, not with kindness, but with questions that have wrong answers. Where does the combustion air enter that stove? Ione pointed to the grate. Below the fuel bed, through the lower draft. Which part is cracked? She held up the broken grate bar. Why can the chimney not be sealed tight where it passes through the roof? Ione paused. Because heat expands the pipe. A tight seal would crack the thimble or warp the joint. Close enough. He pointed to 3 coal pieces she had brought up from the vault, different sizes, from egg-sized lumps to fist-sized chunks. You are going to burn that. Which size do you start with? The smallest. Wrong. You start with wood, then soft coal if you have it, then the smallest hard coal. Anthracite will not take a match. It requires a bed. Ione looked at the 3 pieces. I do not have soft coal. Then you will learn to build a kindling bed that does the same work, but not today. He turned to leave. Will you help me? Ione asked. Jenkins stopped. He did not turn around. I do not help. I trade. You help me inventory the salvaged mine timber at Mina's lower shed. There are 46 pieces that need measuring and marking, and I will inspect your system. If it can be made safe, I will tell you how. If it cannot, I will tell you that instead. And if I refuse? Then you will build a fire in a stove with a cracked grate and a damaged flue, and you will learn about coal gas the way my brother learned about mine gas. Quickly, and without a second lesson, Ione picked up her coat. "Show me the timber," she said. Jenkin turned around. His expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes shifted, the faintest acknowledgement that the answer had been the correct one. "Ignorance can be taught," he said. "Haste usually cannot." They walked down toward Mina's shed in the last cold light of the afternoon, and the stove part stayed on the blanket where they lay, waiting for hands that knew what to do with them. 11 days until lasting snow, a cracked grate, a collapsed chimney joint, half the walls unsealed, no kindling, no soft coal, and a mentor who had agreed to inspect the system but had not agreed to save it. The wind shifted north. It carried the smell of the high country, pine resin, stone dust, and something colder beneath both, something that had no scent at all but pressed against the skin like a hand. Winter was not coming. Winter was already here. It was simply waiting to see whether she would be ready when it stopped being patient. Jenkin returned at dawn with a canvas tool roll and a salvaged grate section that did not match the Rathbones' original but was close enough in width to seat across the firepot rails. He did not announce this. He set the tool roll on the floor, placed the grate section beside the cracked one, and said, "File the bearing edges until they sit flat. I will look at the chimney." Ione filed. The iron was cold and hard, and the file slipped twice across her swollen wrist before she learned to brace the piece against a foundation stone and work with her right hand only. Metal dust collected in the seams of her fingers. The sound filled the cabin, a rhythmic scraping that felt like it belonged to a different kind of life, a life where problems yielded to repetition rather than luck. Jenkin lowered a weighted rag on a cord through the chimney from the roof. It dropped 18 inches and stopped. He pulled it back up. The rag was coated with hardit. He was looking for in a minute. No, let me rewrite properly. Jenkin lowered a weighted rag on a cord through the chimney from the roof line. The rag dropped 18 inches and stopped. He hauled it back. The fabric came up black with white soot and dragging a chunk of collapsed clay the size of his palm. "Your flue joint is separated," he called down. "The lower section must be rebuilt, or the first strong fire will put smoke into the wall." He climbed down and sat on the cabin floor and drew a diagram in the dirt with a nail. The repair required a brick thimble where the stovepipe entered the chimney, fitted stovepipe from the stove collar to the thimble, a clean-out access below the elbow joint, a sheet iron heat shield spaced 2 inches from the wall to prevent the logs from scorching, and a removable exterior cap at the chimney top that could be cleared after heavy snowfall. "Where do I get brick?" Ione asked. "You do not. You get the fire brick from the stove sections I have at Mina's shed. You build the thimble from them. They are meant for heat." "And the stovepipe?" "Olson has scrap pipe behind the boarding house. You already know how to bargain with Olson." Ione went to Olson that afternoon and traded 6 hours of scrubbing the boarding house kitchen floor for 8 feet of used stovepipe and a tin elbow. When she returned, her knees were raw and her wrist throbbed so badly she carried the pipe under her right arm only. Jenkin inspected the pipe sections by rolling them on the floor and watching for wobble. "2 of these are sound. One has a seam that will open under heat. We will use it for the clean-out section where the temperature is lowest." They began the chimney repair the following morning. 10 days remained. The teaching did not feel like teaching. It felt like labor that happened to carry explanations. Jenkin handed Ione a trowel and a bucket of fire clay mixed with sand, and showed her how to butter the thimble bricks so the mortar compressed rather than squeezed out. When she applied too much, he did not correct her. He waited until the excess oozed and dripped and said, "Now you know what too much looks like. Scrape it back and try again." He made her fit the stovepipe to the collar 3 times. The first time the joint was loose enough to rattle. The second time she had crimped it too far, and the pipe would not seat. The third time, it slid on with resistance and held when he pushed against it with his palm. "That is a friction fit," he said. "It should take effort to remove. If it comes off easily, so will your life." The heat shield was a flat piece of sheet iron that Jenkin cut from a damaged mining ventilation panel. He bent it with a hammer and a log edge and nailed it to the wall on wooden standoffs, leaving a 2-inch gap behind it. When Ione asked why the gap mattered, he held a candle behind the shield and showed her the air moving upward in the space. Heat rises in the gap. The rising air carries warmth away from the wood. Without the gap, the shield becomes a conductor, and the wall behind it dries until it ignites. The gap is not empty space. It is the most important part of the shield. Every lesson carried weight. The weight of Cadell, who had died because a space everyone assumed was ventilated was not. Jenkin never mentioned his brother during the teaching. He did not need to. The precision was the memorial, 9 days remaining. The chimney stood. The thimble was set. The stovepipe was fitted. The heat shield was mounted. But the stove itself was still in pieces on the blanket, and the walls still bled cold air through every gap. On the 8th day, Jenkin insisted on the demonstration fire. Not inside the cabin. Outside, on a flat stone beside the north wall, where any mistake would burn nothing but pride. He laid a small pyramid of dry pine splinters, kindling that Ione had gathered from deadfall along the road, wood so dry it snapped between 2 fingers. Above the splinters he placed a handful of wood shavings and 2 pieces of soft, crumbly coal he had taken from a seam near the road cut, coal so inferior that miners left it where it lay. "Light the kindling," he said. Ione struck a match and held it to the splinters. The flame caught. The shavings curled and blackened. The soft coal began to smoke, reluctantly at first, then with a low orange glow. "Now, 3 pieces of the smallest anthracite. No more." She placed them on the glowing bed. The hard coal sat there, black and indifferent, absorbing heat without response. 1 minute, 2, 3. "It is not catching," she said. "Wait." At 4 minutes, a faint blue edge appeared along the bottom of one piece, then another. The blue was not the orange of wood flame or the red of soft coal. It was steady and pale, almost invisible in daylight, and it moved across the surface of the coal like water flowing uphill. "More coal?" Ione asked. "Not yet. Open the draft further. The fire needs air beneath it, not fuel above it." She did not have a draft on the outdoor demonstration. Instead, Jenkins showed her how to blow gently from below, directing air under the coal bed rather than across its top. The blue flames strengthened. The coal pieces began to glow at their edges, not the quick, desperate glow of wood, but something slower and more deliberate, as though the stone were giving back heat it had stored for 100 million years. "Now add 3 more." She added them, too fast. She dropped them on the bed, rather than placing them, and the impact collapsed the air gaps between the coals. The blue flames vanished. The glow died. Smoke rose in a single gray column. Jenkins said nothing. He watched her. Ione looked at the dead fire. She understood what had happened. She had smothered the air that the fire needed. She rebuilt the bed, kindling, shavings, soft coal, waiting, first anthracite, waiting longer, second layer placed, not dropped, with space between each piece for air to rise. The blue flames returned. They held. The coal glowed. "Third layer," Jenkins said. She placed 3 more pieces. The heat rising from the bed was visible now as a shimmer above the stones. The coal cracked softly as it expanded, a sound like a knuckle popping, small and intimate. "That fire will burn for 2 hours without attention," Jenkins said. In a stove with a controlled draft, it will burn for 6. That is the difference between anthracite and wood. Wood demands attention. Hard coal demands understanding. 8 days remaining. Ione could build and sustain a fire. She could not yet do it inside a sealed cabin without killing herself. They rebuilt the stove on the 7th day. Jenkins supervised while Ione assembled each piece, tightening bolts she had cleaned with a wire brush, seating the new grate section she had filed to width, fitting the repaired ash door on its rebent hinge pin. The firepot lining remained broken, but Jenkins showed her how to mix fire clay with crucite crushed fire brick and trowel, a new lining that would harden after the first sustained burn. "It will not last 5 years," he said. "It will last 1 winter if you do not shock it with cold water." The chimney collar connected to the stove pipe with the friction fit she had practiced. The elbow joint directed the pipe into the brick thimble. The clean-out cap below the elbow could be removed with one hand. Jenkins lit no fire that day. Instead, he walked the cabin and refused to let Ione seal every crack. "You are thinking of heat," he said. "Think of air." He identified 2 ventilation points that must remain open. The first was a low inlet on the stove side wall, near the floor, where outside air could enter and feed the draft. The second was a high outlet on the opposite wall, a 6-inch gap between 2 logs near the ceiling, where stale air and any accumulating gas could escape. "But I lose heat through both of those," Ione said. "Yes, and you stay alive through both of those. This is not a choice between comfort and waste. It is a choice between 62 degrees and a funeral. You will keep both openings clear. You will not stuff them with rags during a storm. You will not paste them with clay because the thermometer dropped. If you close them, you die. Not probably, not eventually. You die." He was not shouting. His voice was level and cold and specific, and Ione heard Cadell in every word. Cadell, who had walked into a tunnel where the air was not moving and had not walked out. "I understand," she said. "Then show me where you would put them." She pointed to the low inlet, near the floor on the east wall, where the stove stood. Then she pointed to the high outlet on the west wall above the sleeping corner. Jenkins nodded once. "Now, tell me what to watch for when the stove is running." Ione recited from memory, from the afternoons of watching and listening and filing iron while Jenkins talked. "Sluggish flame, the draft is blocked. Smoke hesitation when the loading door opens, the chimney draw is weak. Headache or sleepiness without cause, gas is accumulating. Soot marks around pipe joints, the seam is leaking. Downdraft during high wind. The cap is obstructed or the external pressure is overcoming the chimney pull." "And what do you do first if you see any of those signs?" "Open the door. Then find the cause." "You open the door before you touch the stove." "I open the door before I touch the stove." He looked at her for a moment that carried more weight than the words that filled it. "Your mother understood coal," he said. "She did not understand mining ventilation. That vault has good drainage, but the air passage is narrow, and the cabin above it has been sealed by someone who was thinking about cold, not gas. You are going to fix that." He handed her the weighted rag. "Drop this through the chimney every 7 days. If it does not fall freely, you have a blockage. Do not burn another pound until you clear it." 6 days remaining. The stove stood assembled. The chimney drew. The ventilation points were marked and left open. The cabin was habitable in the sense that a boat with a hole in it is seaworthy. It would function only as long as the operator understood the flaw and compensated for it every hour of every day. Now came the walls. Jenkins and Ione worked with what they had. Clay from the creek bank, Dry moss gathered from the timber edge where Merritt's prohibition did not reach, strips of old burlap from Mina's dairy shed, and bare hands. They re-chinked the log gaps one at a time. Jenkin demonstrated the first, pushing moss into the crack, pressing clay over it, smoothing the surface flat so the seal would not crack away from the wood as temperatures changed. Then Ione did the rest. It was slow work. The clay was cold and stiff and fought her fingers. The moss wanted to bunch rather than spread. Each gap was a different width, a different depth, a different argument between the logs. Her wrist ached, her fingernails cracked. Clay dried in the lines of her knuckles and drew the moisture from her skin until her hands looked like the hands of a woman twice her age. They repaired the ceiling where boards had separated, closing the gaps that allowed heated air to escape into the roof space. They hung a removable wool curtain across the sleeping corner, creating a smaller volume that could hold warmth through the night. They built a simple interior shutter for the window opening, not glass, which Ione could not afford and Crested Butte could not supply before snow, but a fitted wooden panel backed with a piece of oiled canvas. They packed the north foundation with earth, building a low berm against the logs where wind hit hardest. They installed a clay and stone hearth extension that protected the floor planks from radiant heat and gave the stove a stable base that would not shift as the ground froze and thawed beneath it. Jenkin demonstrated every principle through action. He held a candle flame beside each wall joint after sealing it. Where the flame wavered, the seal was incomplete. Where it burned steady, the joint was tight. Air is honest, he said. It tells you where it enters if you ask the right question. 5 days remaining. The walls were 3/4 sealed. The stove was set. The chimney drew. The coal waited below. Ione's body was paying the price that the work demanded. She carried coal in 30-pound hods up the narrow stone stair, bracing the load against her hip because her left wrist could not bear the full weight of the handle. Each trip took 90 seconds down and 3 minutes up. She made 8 trips a day, building a small working pile beside the stove so she would not need to descend during a storm. Her wrists swelled and subsided and swelled again. Clay split the skin around her fingernails. She lost weight she could not afford to lose because she repeatedly chose work time over meals, eating beans and hard bread in the dark after the light failed and her hands were too stiff to hold a tool. Mina brought a jar of rendered fat and a loaf of bread and refused to call it charity. I am not feeding you, Mina said. I am protecting my investment. If you die, I lose the only neighbor within 2 miles who can sew a straight seam. Ione ate the bread so fast she bit the inside of her cheek. 4 days remaining. The first controlled burn. Jenkin watched from the doorway while Ione built the fire inside the stove for the first time. Kindling, shavings, no soft coal available. She substituted very small anthracite chips, the size of chestnuts, arranged loosely over the kindling bed. A match touched to the pine splinters. Smoke curled upward through the stovepipe. The chimney drew. The draft pulled air through the low inlet across the floor and up into the fire from beneath the grate. After 6 minutes, she placed 3 egg-sized anthracite pieces on the bed. She placed them carefully, with space between, the way she had learned from the outdoor demonstration. She did not drop them. 8 minutes. Blue flame. Thin at first, uncertain, like a candle in a room where someone is about to open a window. Then steadier. The coal accepted the heat and began to return it. She added a second layer after 15 minutes. The stove's iron walls began to warm. She placed her hand near, not on Taisit, the surface, and felt radiant heat push against her palm, the way water pushes against a hand held in a current. The thermometer, a spirit instrument Jenkin had brought from his own wall, read 41 degrees at the start. After 1 hour, it read 53. After 2 hours, 59. After 4 hours, the small cabin held at 63 degrees, while outside the temperature had fallen to 9 above zero. Jenkin recorded the numbers in Ione's ledger. 26 pounds consumed, 63 degrees held, 9 degrees outside. "That is your baseline," he said. "In still air at these temperatures, this room will hold above 60 on 30 pounds per day. Wind will raise the cost. Additional people will raise the cost. A chimney obstruction will raise the cost to everything." He left. Ione sat beside the stove and felt warmth touch her face and her hands, and the places where cold had lived so long it had begun to feel like a permanent resident of her body. She did not cry. She recorded the temperature at the bed, at the table, and at the stove surface, and she wrote the date beside the figures, and she closed the ledger, and she added 3 more pieces of coal to the fire that her mother had made possible and her own hands had learned to tend. 3 days remaining. The coal vault nearly betrayed her. She was filling a hod in the bin, working by lamplight, when the stone wall above the access bay shifted. One of the supporting timbers, an original piece that Martha had not replaced, had rotted through its center while appearing sound on its surface. The stone above it dropped 4 inches and pinned Ione's boot between the wall and the bin floor. She could not pull free. The stone pressed on her ankle, not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough that movement ground the leather against the joint. Her lamp was on the step behind her, out of reach, and the timber groaned as though considering whether to give way entirely. She shouted. The sound went up through the trapdoor and through the cabin and out through the chinking gaps and across the snow to wherever Mina was walking. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Mina arrived first. She came down the stairs and assessed the scene and said nothing unnecessary. "Can you feel your toes?" "Yes." "Can you move the stone?" "Not from this angle." Jenkin arrived 10 minutes later. He looked at the rotted timber and the shifted stone and the trapped boot and the angle of the remaining supports, and his face went still in a way that Ione had not seen before. "The wall is moving," he said quietly. "If we pull the wrong stone, the bay collapses." He did not say what that would mean for Ione's ankle. He did not need to. Jenkin braced a salvaged mine timber horizontally against the shifted stone and wedged a second vertical support beneath it. Mina held the lamp. Ione pressed her back against the bin partition and pulled her foot straight backward while Jenkin levered the stone upward with the pry bar. The boot came free. The stone settled onto the new timber. The wall held. Ione's ankle was bruised to the color of a plum, but not broken. She climbed the stairs on her hands and her right knee while Mina carried the coal hod behind her. Jenkin ordered the coal nearest. The weak wall moved immediately. 200 pounds shifted to the far side of the bin, each hod carried by Mina, while Ione sat above with her ankle wrapped in wet cloth. The work cost an entire day. 1 full day of the 3 remaining, spent not building or sealing or preparing, but repairing damage that the underground space had been hiding since Martha sealed the hatch. 2 days remaining. The vault was shored. The stove worked. The chimney drew. The walls were sealed except for the ventilation points. But the roof still leaked on its western side, and the chimney cap, the removable exterior cover that would prevent snow from blocking the flue, was not yet finished. Ione could complete one, not both. She chose the chimney cap. A leaking roof meant a wet blanket and a miserable night. A block chimney meant a room filling with gas while she slept. Jenkin agreed. Mina did not argue. Ione divided the remaining coal into 150 marked allotments using Martha's tally system. Each allotment represented approximately 40 pounds, 1 day of moderate consumption plus a reserve margin. She scratched the marks into the bin wall beside Martha's original tallies, daughter's handwriting next to mother's, separated by 3 years of silence. Leander Phelps returned. Merritt had filed the condemnation request, and Leander was required by his county position to inspect the property. He arrived on horseback with a leather notebook and the expression of a man who expected to confirm what he already knew. He saw the stove. He tested the chimney draw by holding a lit match at the clean-out. The flame bent inward and held. He examined the heat shield and measured the wall clearance with his hand. Adequate, he said, which was as close to praise as Leander permitted himself. He looked at the sealed walls. He tested the ventilation points and nodded. He opened the trap door and descended into the vault and stood among the coal and said nothing for a long time. When he climbed back up, his face carried a different argument than the one he had brought. "The vault is sound," he said. "The drainage works. The shoring is recent." He looked at Ione. "Who rebuilt the bay support?" "Treharn. He knows his business." Leander closed the trap door and stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the thermometer on the wall. It read 61 degrees. Outside, the morning temperature was 12 above. "You have replaced 6 cords of certainty with a hole full of calculation," he said. "The calculation works," Ione replied. 26 pounds held 63 degrees through a 9-degree night. One cold night is not a winter. One test is not proof. You are betting everything on a system that has never been run continuously through a storm with sustained wind, deep cold, chimney loading, and the kind of desperation that makes a person close every vent because the thermometer is falling and the body says warmth matters more than air. He wrote in his notebook. He did not condemn the shack. "I cannot call this unfit," he said, "but I will not call it sufficient. If you survive December, I will reconsider." He rode out without offering good luck. Merritt came that afternoon. The condemnation had failed, and his face showed it, a tightness around the jaw that Ione had learned to read years ago, back when it preceded his worst moods, and the household learned to stay quiet. He did not threaten. He offered. $15 for the parcel. Cash. Today. $15 would pay for a room in Crested Butte through January. It would buy food. It would buy time to find work, or passage to Denver, or a train ticket to somewhere warmer where 7 acres of frozen rock and a dead woman's coal would no longer be her problem. Ione looked at the stove. She looked at the chimney. She looked at the trap door, closed now, the hearthstone seated above it with Martha's pale clay seal, freshly reapplied. No. Merritt left. He did not slam the door. He closed it carefully, the way a man handles something he intends to break later when no one is watching. The section ends, but the morning does not end quietly. At dawn, Ione found a coil of stovepipe wire and a short roof ladder leaning against the north wall of the shack. No note. No footprints leading to the ranch. The wind had filled them. Lowell. It could only have been Lowell. He had not knocked. He had not spoken. He had left tools in the dark, and his doing so meant that Merritt's hold on the family had cracked somewhere that Merritt had not thought to look. Ione used the wire to secure a loose stovepipe joint. She used the ladder to mount the chimney cap, a simple tin hood she had bent from scrap, designed to deflect falling snow without blocking the draft. She was on the roof when she heard it, not wind. Wind, she knew. This was a different sound, a low, sustained hiss, followed by the whisper of something heavy sliding across something solid. Snow, not falling snow, moving snow. The first real accumulation of the season sliding off the mesa slope and settling against the ridge, filling the hollows, erasing the road, covering the landmarks that told a person where the ground ended and the empty air began. Lasting winter had arrived, 2 days earlier than Leander had predicted. Ione climbed down the ladder and went inside and closed the door and opened the stove's loading door and placed 3 pieces of anthracite on the glowing bed and watched the blue flames rise. The system had never run through a storm. The chimney had never faced sustained wind load. The ventilation had never been tested at temperatures below 0. The coal consumption rate was based on 1 4-hour burn in still moderate cold. Everything she had built was a theory. Everything she was about to face was real. For 3 weeks, the theory held. Ione recorded every morning, outdoor temperature at dawn, indoor temperature at the bed and near the stove, pounds of coal added, ash removed, wind direction estimated by the sound against the walls, hours between tending. Consumption settled into a pattern. On calm days with temperatures between 10 and 20 degrees, the stove burned 28 to 30 pounds. On windy days or when the temperature dropped below 10, it rose to 32 or 34. On the rare still morning when the sun hit the south wall, she let the fire decline to a maintenance glow and used as little as 22 pounds. The cabin held 64 to 68 degrees at the table, 58 to 62 at the bed, 74 degrees or higher immediately beside the stove, where the radiant heat felt like standing near a warm animal. The roof leaked on the western corner during wind-driven snow, but the leak was manageable. A slow drip that she caught in a tin and emptied twice a day. The wool curtain across the sleeping corner held warmth through the night. The interior shutter cut the draft from the window, opening to almost nothing. She ate beans, bread, and dried beef purchased with her remaining $1.40 plus credit Mina extended in exchange for continued sewing. She was hungry most of the time, but not starving. She was cold when she slept, but not dangerously so. She was alone, but the stove's low crackle and the occasional pop of expanding coal provided a kind of company, steady, reliable, indifferent to whether she deserved it. Jenkin came on snowshoes after the first heavy accumulation. He inspected the ledger and nodded at the entries. Then he deliberately tested her. He closed the lower draft control to a slit, far narrower than Ione would have set it. Within 3 minutes, the blue flames above the coal bed weakened. Within 5, they disappeared. The coal still glowed, but the glow was dark red and sullen, and the stove began to tick as its iron cooled. "What is the stove telling you?" Jenkin asked. Ione looked at the draft control. She looked at the coal bed through the mica patch. She listened to the chimney. The draw was weak. She could hear it in the stovepipe, a faint whistle that had gone silent. The draft is too low. The fire is starving. "What do you do?" "Open the lower control. Clear ash from the grate. Re-establish the bed." "Do it." She opened the control with the chain. Air moved beneath the grate. She used the shaker bar to clear accumulated ash, a fine gray dust that fell into the ash pan with a soft whisper. The coal bed brightened. In 2 minutes, blue flames returned, thin at first, then steady. "You waited too long," Jenkins said. By the time the flames disappeared, the coal bed had begun to cool. Another 5 minutes and you would have lost the fire entirely. Relighting anthracite from a cold bed in a cold room is an hour's work if you have kindling and impossible if you do not. He reached into his coat and produced a piece of chalk. He drew a mark on the stove's draft lever, a white line showing the minimum safe position. "Never below this mark. Not in calm air, not in a storm, not if someone tells you it wastes fuel. Below this mark, you are not saving coal. You are building a gas chamber." Then he set emergency rations, speaking as though he were prescribing medicine. 36 pounds for ordinary severe cold, 48 during high wind or additional occupancy. Never load beyond the firepot shoulder. Overfilling smothers the draft from above. And never sacrifice ventilation merely to raise the thermometer. A room at 55 degrees with moving air is a room where people wake up in the morning. A room at 65 with dead air is a room where they do not. Ione recorded the marks and the numbers. Her ledger was becoming a manual. Martha's original tally system expanded with Jenkins' operational limits, her own consumption data, and the daily record that would prove, if proof were ever needed, that the system functioned because it was managed, not because it was magical. Mina converted on a night in late November when the temperature fell to 4 below zero. She came not to test the system, but because her own chimney had developed a rattling sound that worried her, and she wanted to compare it with Ione's draw. She brought her 6-year-old nephew, Ephraim, who had been living with her since his parents moved to Pueblo for railroad work. The three of them slept in the cabin that night. Ione adjusted the burn to account for the additional bodies and the heat they generated. She added coal at midnight, 38 pounds total for the night, and opened the high ventilation point slightly wider because 3 people produced more moisture and more exhaled air. At dawn, the room was 61 degrees. Ephraim was still asleep. Mina sat at the table looking at the thermometer with an expression that Ione recognized as arithmetic being revised. 38 pounds, Mina said. For 3 people through a night of 4 below. The coal supply, how long at this rate? If the entire winter ran at 4 below with 3 occupants, approximately 115 days. It will not. Moderate days will reduce consumption. But even the worst projection gives me through April. Mina looked at the stove. She looked at the coal hod. She looked at Ione. I believe the fuel will last, she said. I do not yet believe the operator will. The road, the chimney, the solitude. Coal does not fix those. It was not full conversion. It was the acknowledgement that Ione's numbers worked, offered by a woman for whom numbers were the only currency that mattered. The remaining doubt was personal, not technical, and Ione accepted it as honestly given. Across the valley, the ranch was burning through its abundance. Merritt heated 4 structures continuously: the main house, the cookhouse, the bunkhouse, and the calving shed. Each one demanded attention, labor, and fuel. The main house alone consumed more wood in a week than Ione burned coal in a month, because the house was large, the walls were sound but not sealed for efficiency, the rooms were numerous, and the stoves were fed by habit rather than measurement. In mid-November, Merritt had looked prosperous. The woodlot was stacked high. The hired men kept the fires burning. The house was warm. By late November, the picture shifted. Ranch hands dismantled an unused fence for firewood. The calving shed supply was moved to the house, leaving the shed dependent on whatever could be gathered between storms. The woodlot's neat stacks developed gaps. Leander, passing the ranch on county business, noticed slab wood and bark disappearing into the main house, inferior fuel that burned fast and produced more smoke than heat. It was the kind of fuel a household used when the good wood was running low and the pretense of surplus was more important than the reality of its absence. Merritt's mistake was not incompetence. His mistake was scale. He had inherited a large operation and maintained it at full size because reducing it would have been visible, and visibility would have been admission, and admission was a thing Merritt Satterlee could not afford while his youngest sister heated 7 acres with a hole in the floor. The warm afternoon came on January 5th, 1887. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in weeks. Sun hit the south-facing slopes and softened the snow surface. Water ran in small channels down the road ruts. The air smelled different. Not warm exactly, but less hostile, as though the cold had drawn a single breath before speaking again. The settlers who had survived enough winters knew what a January thaw meant. Not relief, instability. Warm air beneath cold air. Wet snow on top of dry snow. Weight accumulating on slopes that had been holding still only because everything was frozen in place. That night, the temperature dropped 31 degrees in 7 hours. The wet surface froze into a crust. Wind built through the Slate River Valley, loading the eastern slopes with new snow that clung to the ice layer beneath it, like a coat hung on a nail that was already pulling loose from the wall. Shortly before dawn, on January 7th, Ione woke to a sound she had never heard before. A crack. Sharp, enormous, like a tree trunk splitting but multiplied by 1,000, followed by a prolonged roar that lasted 15 seconds and shook the ground beneath her floor. Avalanche. The timber road was gone. The 9-day storm began that morning, and it began the way catastrophic things begin, not with a single dramatic blow, but with a steady, relentless accumulation that did not stop. Snow fell sideways. Wind stripped the upper ridges and deposited the snow in the valleys, against the buildings, around the fences, over the road that connected the ranch and the shack to Crested Butte. By afternoon, the door of Ione's cabin opened against a drift that reached her waist. She raised the burn to 42 pounds. The thermometer read 67. At the ranch, Merritt ordered hands to cut standing timber beyond the avalanche deposit. Leander, who had been unable to return to town before the road closed, stopped them. A second smaller slide had crossed the route they intended to use. Sending men into unstable terrain to cut wood was not desperation. It was a selection of who would die first. On the second day, the main ranch consumed wood continuously. 3 stoves in the kitchen range ate fuel without pause. The house was warmer than Ione's cabin, perhaps 72 degrees in the central rooms, but only because the consumption was enormous and the labor to maintain it was constant. Merritt moved wood from the calving shed to the main house. Lowell argued against it. "The calves will freeze," Lowell said. "The calves are livestock," Merritt replied. "The house is where we sleep." "We could close the formal rooms, move everyone into the kitchen, 1 stove instead of 3. And tell the hired men what? That we cannot heat our own house? That the girl in the shack has a better winter than we do?" Lowell said nothing more. The formal rooms stayed heated. The calving shed went cold. Newborn calves pressed together in the dark and waited for a warmth that did not come. On the 3rd day, Mina's chimney collar loosened. The wind had been working at the joint where the stovepipe met the wall thimble, and the mortar cracked and the pipe shifted a 1/4 inch, enough to admit smoke into the wall cavity rather than directing it up the flue. Mina smelled it before she saw it, the sharp, acrid bite of creosote in places where creosote should not be. She shut down her stove. The temperature in her cabin began to drop. She had no materials and no conditions to repair the joint. She wrapped Ephraim in every blanket she owned and walked 2 miles through thigh-deep snow to Ione's door. Ione opened it. The cabin went from 1 occupant to 3. Mina's hands were white. Ephraim's lips were blue. Ione put the boy on the bed nearest the stove and wrapped him in the sleeping blanket and fed the fire until the air beside him reached 71 degrees. She hung a second curtain, dividing the sleeping area from the working area. She allocated positions, Ephraim nearest the stove, Mina beside him, Ione on the outer edge where the temperature was lowest but the ventilation point was accessible. She raised consumption to 48 pounds. The stove's iron sides radiated heat into a room that now held three people, three sets of lungs, three bodies releasing moisture and drawing oxygen. The system could protect more people. Every additional person was proof that the method worked. And every additional person consumed food, used air, and shortened the coal supply that Ione could not replenish. On the fourth day, the ranch collapsed inward. Merritt's accessible split wood fell below 2 days' supply. The furniture began to look like fuel. Stall partitions in the empty calving shed were discussed, then dismantled. A ranch hand named Warren Pike, 34 years old, reliable, quiet, and worth more to the ranch's daily operation than most of the furniture being burned, attempted to reach a remote woodpile near the timberline. The distance was less than a mile. In clear weather, the walk took 20 minutes. In the conditions of January 10th, 1887, a mile might as well have been 10. Warren became disoriented in blowing snow within a quarter mile. He wandered west instead of north. His feet broke through a crusted drift into softer snow beneath, and the effort of extracting himself repeated with every step until his legs stopped cooperating, and he sat down beside a fence post and began to feel warm in the way that people feel warm when their body has surrendered the argument with cold. Lowell found him by following the fence line, checking each post. Warren was conscious but could not stand. His speech was slow, and his fingers had stopped bending. Lowell looked down the valley toward the main ranch house. He looked up the slope toward Ione's shack. The shack was closer by 300 yards. He carried Warren to Ione's door. Merritt followed 20 minutes later. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway and looked at his sister's cabin, the stove glowing, the thermometer reading 68, the coal hod full, his ranch hand wrapped in blankets on the bed, and his face showed something that was not anger. It was the expression of a man watching a structure he had built come apart in a sequence he could not reverse. Ione stepped aside. Merritt entered. She did not demand an apology. She did not ask for acknowledgement. She moved the second curtain and made room. By the fifth day, 7 people occupied a room built for one. Ione, Mina, Ephraim, Jenkin, who had been checking the chimney cap before the road closed and could not return to his own cabin. Lowell, Warren Pike, and Merritt, 12 feet by 14 feet, 168 square feet, 24 square feet per person, a space the size of a generous closet for each body, and every body producing heat and moisture, and the kind of proximity that turned private people into a single organism with 7 opinions about ventilation. Warren needed warming, not fast. Fast rewarming was as dangerous as the cold itself, something Jenkins stated once and firmly. Warren's wet clothing came off and hung on a line strung near but safely clear of the stove. Dry wool replaced it. His hands were placed in cloth, not held near the iron. He was given warm water in small amounts. The room's temperature held at 69 degrees near the table. The bed area dropped to 60 because the additional curtains blocked some of the stove's radiant reach. Beside the stove, the temperature climbed to 76 degrees, and the air there shimmered faintly with the heat rising from the iron surface. Fuel consumption climbed to 54 pounds per day. At that rate, the remaining coal lasted approximately 95 days. The winter had not yet reached its worst, but food became the sharper problem. Ione's stores had been planned for one person. 7 people ate through 2 days of rations in a single day. Mina had brought a small sack of dried meat. Jenkin had nothing. The ranch workers had nothing. Condensation collected on the ceiling boards and dripped onto the sleeping blankets. The high ventilation point worked, but 7 people breathing in a 12 by 14 room produced moisture faster than the opening could clear it. and then Merritt saw the vault. He descended the stone stair while Ione was adjusting the stove draft. When he came back up, his expression had changed, not softened, sharpened. "There is more than 2 tons remaining," he said. "That coal has value. If it were on the open market in Crested Butte, it would be worth more than your parcel." "It is not on the market," Ione said. "It is in my cellar. Our mother bought it with household money. Our mother bought it with butter, eggs, and sewing money she earned and recorded separately. Amzie Bell has the account book. If you want to file a claim, you will need to explain to the county why your mother kept a separate ledger and hid her savings underground rather than trusting her husband or her eldest son to preserve them." The room was silent. 7 people in a space smaller than a ranch kitchen, and the only sound was the low hiss of the stove and the wind pressing against the shuttered window. Jenkins spoke from the corner where he sat with his bad leg extended on a folded blanket. "The coal was here," he said. "The stove was not. The sound pipe was not. The hands that made it work were not. If you had found this vault in September, Merritt, what would you have done with it? Burned it in an open fireplace. Sold it by the wagon load. Your mother hid it because she knew what you would do. Your sister found it because she knew what to look for. If you are invested in Ione's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because the next decision can save everyone in that room or leave them unconscious beside a burning stove." On the 6th morning, the chimney stopped drawing. Ione noticed it first as a sensation rather than a measurement. The air in the cabin felt heavy, not warm, not cold, but dense, as though the room had been sealed inside a bottle. The blue flames above the coal bed, which had been steady through the night, flickered once and went out. The coal still glowed. That was the danger. A glowing coal bed producing combustion gases in a room where the chimney no longer pulled those gases upward was a room filling with carbon monoxide. The gas that Jenkins had described, the gas that had killed Cadell, the gas that had no smell and no color and announced its presence through headache, confusion, and then silence. Ione felt the headache beginning, a dull pressure behind her eyes, as though someone were pressing thumbs against her temples. She did not open the loading door. Opening the door would release whatever gas had accumulated in the firebox directly into the room. She did not wake the others. Not yet. She stood up slowly, fighting a wave of dizziness, and went to the low ventilation inlet. Air moved through it, but weakly. The wind outside was pressing against the cabin from the east, and the chimney's draft depended on the difference between the warm air rising inside the pipe and the cold air pressing down outside it. When the wind exceeded the draft's pull, the chimney stalled. When snow packed around the exterior cap, the pipe became a sealed column with nowhere for the gas to go. Jenkins was awake. He had heard her move. "The cap," he said. His voice was calm in the way that very experienced people are calm when the situation is exactly as bad as they expected it might become. He began to stand. His left leg buckled. The old injury, the rock fall in the shaft, the 2 hours pinned, had stiffened through the cold night, and the leg would not take his weight. "I cannot climb," he said. He said it the way he said everything, as a fact, measured and delivered without apology. "The system is yours now." Ione looked at the roof. She looked at the sleeping figures. Ephraim curled against Mina, Warren still bandaged, Lowell breathing slowly, Merritt motionless on the far side. She put on her coat and opened the door. The wind hit her like a wall of moving sand made of ice. Snow drove horizontally across the slope. The world beyond the cabin was white and featureless and loud, a roar that was not thunder and not wind, but both combined into a sound that occupied every frequency at once. The roof ladder was buried under 2 feet of drift on the north side. She dug it free with her hands because the shovel was inside, and she would not go back in without finishing. Her fingers numbed within a minute. She jammed the ladder against the wall and tied herself to the chimney side rail with a double loop of rope, the same harness technique she had used when mounting the cap in calmer weather. She crawled rather than walked. The roof pitch was shallow, but the surface was ice under snow, and standing meant falling, and falling meant the ground 7 feet below, and the ground meant a broken ankle or a broken back and 7 people in a room with a dead chimney. The cap was buried. Not just covered, buried. Wind-driven snow had packed around it and frozen into a shell that enclosed the pipe opening completely. No air could enter. No gas could leave. She struck the ice with the shortened axe handle. The first blow glanced off. The second cracked the shell. The third broke it open, and she heard the chimney exhale. A gust of warm, stale air rushing upward through the pipe as the draft reestablished itself. She cleared the remaining ice from around the cap's edges, ensuring the opening was wide enough to draw freely, and then she crawled back to the ladder and climbed down and went inside and closed the door and stood there shaking while ice melt ran from her hair into her collar. The room was cold, 58 degrees. Warren shivered violently beneath his blankets. Ephraim had woken and was pressing against Mina with wide, quiet eyes. Merritt sat up. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the stove, which still glowed but produced no flame. He looked at Ione standing by the door with ice in her hair and her swollen wrist cradled against her chest. "It failed," he said. Ione said nothing. She walked to the stove. She did not open the loading door. She opened the lower draft control with the chain and heard air begin to move beneath the grate. She waited. 1 minute, 2. The coal bed brightened. 3 minutes. A thin blue edge appeared along the nearest piece of anthracite. The flames returned, steady, pale, moving across the coal bed like water flowing over stone. She opened the loading door now, carefully, 1 inch at a time, and the draft pulled any remaining gas upward through the pipe rather than outward into the room. She added 3 pieces of coal, then 3 more. The thermometer began to climb. 59, 61, 63. Ione sat down on the floor beside the stove and recorded the time, the temperature, and the cause of the chimney failure in her ledger. Her handwriting was uneven because her hands were shaking, but the numbers were precise. Jenkin watched her write from across the room. "Your mother left a ledger," he said quietly, because she knew that proof must survive memory and argument. The 6th day ended with the room at 66 degrees and the chimney drawing freely. Ione checked the draft every 2 hours. She did not sleep. On the 7th morning, the main ranch house had frozen through its exterior rooms. The interior water bucket near the kitchen stove still held liquid, but in the parlor, the hallway, and the upstairs bedrooms, ice formed on every surface. Merritt's remaining family, his wife, Margaret, and their 2 small children, had retreated to the kitchen and closed the doors. Lowell reported this when he returned from a brief crossing to the ranch to check on the stock. Several cattle had died, frozen standing in the calving shed. The formal rooms that Merritt had refused to close were now sealed by ice rather than decision. Ione did not say what she could have said. She did not point out that Merritt's house contained 20 times the volume of her cabin and that no amount of wood could have heated it efficiently during a sustained storm. She said something different, and it mattered more. "Your kitchen is smaller than this cabin," she told Lowell. "Close the unused rooms. Move 1 small stove from the parlor into the kitchen if the pipe will reach the chimney. Block the stairwell with quilts and anything heavy. Stop heating space you're not using. Burn whatever wood remains in a single controlled fire in the smallest room with the most people. Lowell listened. He asked her to repeat the part about the stairwell. Then he went back through the snow. Ione had given away the principle that had saved her. Not the coal, not the stove, not the vault. The principle. Heated volume is the variable that determines whether you survive, and reducing it is free. On the 8th day, the storm peaked. Wind shook the cabin walls hard enough to dislodge clay from 3 chinking joints. Ione resealed them with cold fingers while the stove burned 51 pounds of coal. The temperature outside was estimated at 22 below zero based on the frost patterns on the interior walls. A rough measurement, but consistent with the conditions. Inside the cabin, the thermometer read 64 degrees near the table. Beside the stove, 79. At the bed, 62. 7 people ate the last of the dried meat and drank hot water heated on the stove's surface. On the 9th day, the wind died. The sky cleared. The temperature rose to 3 above zero, which felt, after 9 days of sustained cold, like something almost approaching mercy. Ione opened the door. Snow had buried the entrance to the height of the lintel. She dug a passage with the grain shovel while the others watched. When the passage was clear, she descended into the vault and counted. The 9-day emergency had consumed 487 pounds of coal, less than 500, less than a quarter ton. More than 2 1/2 tons remained. Mina's nephew was asleep. Warren Pike could stand and move his fingers. Lowell's face had lost the tight, guarded expression it had carried since the will reading. Merritt stood by the stove and said nothing, and looked at the coal hod and the ledger and the thermometer and the woman who had built all of it from a dead woman's chalk marks and a broken stove and $9.40. The sky outside was blue and still, and so bright it hurt to look at it. The snow was deep and white and utterly silent. The crisis was over. The coal had held. The chimney had held. The stove had held. Ione had held. But survival was only the first answer. The valley was watching now, and what Ione did with what she had proven would determine whether the method died in a 12 by 14-foot room or became something larger than one woman's winter. The road to Crested Butte opened on the 4th day after the storm. A teamster and 2 miners broke through the final drift with shovels and a mule team, and the first wagon to reach the upper valley carried mail, flour, and news that 3 people had died in town. 2 from exposure and 1 from a chimney fire that started in a wall cavity where creosote had accumulated for years without anyone checking. Leander Phelps rode up the Slate River Road the following morning. His horse moved slowly through the packed snow, and Leander himself moved slowly off the horse. His left arm was in a sling, broken when his own roof shed its snow load, and a timber brace gave way during the storm's 8th day. He had set the bone himself with a splint made from a chair leg and strips of bed sheet, because the doctor in Crested Butte had been unreachable. He did not go to the ranch first. He went to the shack. Ione opened the door. The cabin behind her was empty now. Mina and Ephraim had returned home the previous day. Warren Pike had walked to the ranch under his own power. Lowell and Merritt had left without ceremony, and Jenkin had snowshoed back to his own cabin with a promise to return. The room smelled of coal ash, damp wool, and 7 bodies' worth of condensation drying slowly from the ceiling boards. Leander entered and stood in the center of the room and began his inspection the way he did everything, methodically, without haste, and without any indication that he had already formed an opinion. He opened the trap door and descended into the vault. He measured the remaining coal depth with a yardstick. He counted the tally marks, Martha's original 6, and Ione's daily consumption, marks running in tight rows beside them. He examined the drainage sump, which held 2 inches of snow melt that had entered through the foundation crack and been directed away from the coal by Martha's gravel channels. He climbed back up and examined the stove. He tested the chimney draw. He opened the clean-out and found it clear. He looked at the heat shield and measured the wall gap with his good hand. He read the ledger. Every entry, from the first 4-hour test burn through the 9-day emergency. And he set it down on the table without comment. He walked to the sleeping corner and counted the marks where 7 bodies had lain. He looked at the curtain hooks. He touched the ventilation points, the low inlet still open, the high outlet still clear. Then he put on his hat and walked outside and stood in the snow and looked down the valley toward the ranch. The main house was visible from the ridge, a large, handsome building with smoke rising from the kitchen chimney only. The formal rooms were dark. The calving shed's doors hung open. Even from a distance, the property looked like a body that had lost circulation in its extremities. Leander came back inside. "Show me your numbers," he said. Ione opened the ledger to the crisis period. 9 days, 487 pounds consumed. Average daily consumption across single and multiple occupancy. Temperature readings at 3 points. Wind notations. Chimney incidents logged with time and cause. Ash volume recorded in cups. Leander read it twice. His face was the face of a man performing arithmetic that contradicted a calculation he had carried for 40 years. "I counted cords," he said. "She counted heat. I was measuring the wrong thing." He closed the ledger. "The condemnation request is withdrawn. I will file the inspection as satisfactory." He did not say he was sorry. He did not say she had been right. He said that he had measured the wrong thing, which was a larger admission from Leander Phelps than most people received in a lifetime. He rode to the ranch. Ione watched him go, and then she sat beside the stove and added 3 pieces of coal to a fire that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone except the winter itself. The validation did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated the way the coal had accumulated in Martha's vault, piece by piece, carried and placed by different hands. Mina came back 2 days after Leander's inspection. She brought her damaged chimney collar and asked Ione to help her examine it. They found the failure, a hairline crack in the mortar where the thimble met the wall. Frostheave had worked at it through 3 winters, widening the gap a fraction of an inch each year until the wind found it and forced smoke into the cavity. "How did yours survive?" Mina asked, meaning Ione's chimney. Jenkin built the thimble from fire brick and set it in fire clay. He used a brick that was designed for heat rather than common mortar that was designed for weight. "Can you show me the difference?" Ione could. She took Mina into the vault and showed her the fire brick fragments Martha had stored, extras from the original thimble construction, and explained the difference between fire clay, which expanded and contracted with the stovepipe, and common mortar, which cracked. Mina held a piece of fire brick in one hand and a piece of her own crumbled mortar in the other. "How much would it cost to replace my thimble?" "The brick costs nothing. I have enough. The labor is a day. You supply clay from the creek bank and I supply the technique." "What do you want in return?" "Teach me how you keep your dairy accounts through winter. I need a system for tracking food stores, not just fuel." Mina looked at her for a moment that was not calculation, but something closer to recognition, the understanding that Ione was not offering charity and was not accepting dependency and was not performing generosity. She was building a network of exchanged competence, the same way Martha had built a coal vault, 1 piece at a time, against a winter that had not yet arrived. "Tomorrow," Mina said, "bring the fire brick." Lowell came next. He did not come to the shack. He waited until Ione was in town, purchasing beans and lard with credit that the general store now extended because Leander had filed the inspection and the store owner had heard the story from Warren Pike. Lowell found her outside the store. He stood 3 feet away and looked at the snow on his boots. "The kitchen method worked," he said. "Margaret and the children stayed warm. The quilts in the stairwell held the heat in the kitchen better than I expected." "How much wood did you use?" "Less than half what the full house would have required, maybe less than a third." "Then you understand the principle." "I understand that my sister told me how to save my brother's wife and children, and my brother has not thanked you for it." "I did not do it for thanks." Lowell nodded. He reached into his coat and produced Martha's household account book. Not the butter and egg ledger that proved the coal purchases, but the daily account of ranch provisions, firewood consumption, candle use, soap production, and fabric purchases that Martha had maintained for 11 years. "Merritt took this from the house safe after the reading," Lowell said. "He did not want anyone to see how carefully Mother tracked the household. It made his management look careless by comparison." Ione took the book. It was heavy in her hands, heavier than its pages and binding could account for, as though the years of entries had accumulated a kind of mass that paper alone did not possess. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me. I should have given it to you in October." He walked back toward the ranch. Ione opened the book on the store's porch and turned to the winter pages and found what she expected. Martha's wood consumption record showed that the main ranch house burned between 9 and 12 cords per winter, and that Martha had been arguing for a smaller winter room since 1881. The argument was noted in the margins, not as a narrative, but as figures. Martha had calculated the heat loss of the full house versus a reduced kitchen-only configuration and shown that the same comfort could be maintained with 40% less fuel. Beside the calculation, in different ink, was a single word: no. Dexter's answer. One word against a page of arithmetic. Martha had built the vault because the arithmetic had been refused. The community came in ones and twos through the rest of January and into February. A rancher named Stott, who ran cattle 8 miles south, rode up because Warren Pike had told his wife about the coal stove and the thermometer readings, and the fact that 7 people had survived 9 days in a room smaller than Stott's front porch. Stott was not interested in coal. He burned wood and had adequate timber. What he wanted was the principle. "How warm does my barn need to be?" he asked. "It does not need to be warm," Ione said. "It needs to not freeze. Those are different problems. A barn at 35 degrees loses no cattle. A barn at 65 degrees wastes fuel that should be in the house. My wife keeps the house stove running all night. She says the children will freeze." "How large is the room where the children sleep?" Stott described it. Ione asked 3 questions: how many windows, how high the ceiling, whether the chimney drew when the wind came from the north. "Close the room above the children with a curtain," she said. "The heated air will stay below the curtain. The stove can run lower. Your wife will use less wood and the children will be warmer because the warm air has less space to fill." Stott looked skeptical. Then he looked at the thermometer on Ione's wall, which read 66 degrees while a 12-degree wind blew outside. "How much did that coal cost?" he asked. "Less than the wood it replaced, but the cost is not the fuel. The cost is the preparation." Stott left. 2 weeks later, his wife sent word through Mina that the curtain worked and the children's room was warmer on less wood than before. Jenkin returned in early February on snowshoes, carrying a leather satchel and a persistent cough that he dismissed as dust from a repair job in town. He and Ione spent 3 days preparing what neither of them called a class, but both understood as one. They set up a demonstration in Ione's cabin. Jenkin dismantled the stove's lower section, while Ione narrated. Not because she needed an audience, but because Jenkin wanted to hear whether she could explain the system to someone who had never seen it. She showed the grate and the ash pan and the draft chain. Air enters below the coal, she said, not above it. Wood burns from the top. Anthracite burns from the bottom. If you feed air above the bed, you waste it. If you feed it below, the coal draws it up through itself, and the combustion happens inside the fuel, not on its surface. She showed the ash accumulation. This is the most common failure. Ash falls through the grate and collects in the pan. If the pan fills, the ash reaches the grate bars and blocks the air. The fire starves. Most people add more coal when the fire weakens. That is the wrong response. The right response is to clear the ash. She showed the chimney clean out. Every fire produces residue. In a sound chimney, the residue exits at the top. In a blocked chimney, it collects at the bends. The clean out lets you remove it without dismantling the pipe. If you do not have a clean out, you must dismantle the pipe every month. If you do not do that, you will have a chimney fire or a gas accumulation, and you will not know which one until it is too late for the answer to matter. She showed the heat shield. The gap behind this plate is not wasted space. Air rises in the gap and carries heat away from the wall. Without the gap, the wood behind the shield dries and ignites. The shield is not protecting the wall. The air in the gap is protecting the wall. The shield is just the thing that creates the gap. Jenkins stood in the corner and watched. At no point did he correct her. At no point did he add information. At no point did he step forward to demonstrate something she had gotten wrong. When she finished, he nodded once. "You missed nothing," he said. Then he went outside and coughed for 2 minutes into a cloth that came away spotted with something darker than dust. 12 families attended the demonstration over the next week, arriving in ones and twos because the road could not handle more. Not all of them burned coal. Not all of them could afford a stove. Not all of them had cellars or access to anthracite or the time to build a vault. Ione did not pretend to offer a universal solution. She offered adaptations. For families with adequate wood but poor heat retention, she taught room division, curtain hanging, and chimney maintenance. For families with coal stoves but no understanding of draft management, she taught the grate system, the ash cycle, and the ventilation balance. For families with neither coal nor sound stoves, she taught the principle of heated volume, reduce the space, seal the waste, keep the chimney clear, and measure the fuel so that panic does not replace arithmetic when the storm arrives. She wrote nothing down. The families who came took the information in their heads and carried it home and applied it according to their own circumstances. Some did it well. Some did it poorly. Some did not do it at all. But the knowledge had left the shack, and Ione understood that release knowledge was more durable than hidden knowledge, even if it was less controllable. Merritt's response to the validation was not silence. Silence would have been acceptance. What Merritt offered was escalation. He refused to acknowledge Ione in public. When neighbors mentioned her name, he changed the subject. When Lowell brought up the kitchen method that had saved Margaret and the children, Merritt said that any competent person would have thought of it. But his private tactics sharpened. He filed a claim through Amzebel, arguing that Martha had used ranch household funds to purchase the coal, and that the purchases being made without Dexter's written consent constituted misappropriation of estate assets. Amzi examined the evidence. Martha's butter and egg ledger showed income earned separately from ranch operations. Small amounts accumulated over years, never large enough to attract attention, always recorded with the same meticulous figures that characterized everything Martha touched. The coal had been purchased in small quantities from 3 different suppliers over 2 summers, transported on a borrowed mule cart, and carried into the vault by hand. Martha had spent her own money. She had kept her own records. She had hidden her preparation inside the margin of a household that did not notice a woman's egg income because it did not consider a woman's egg income worth noticing. Amzie informed Merritt that the claim had no standing. Merritt changed tactics again. He blocked the wagon road that crossed the main ranch, arguing that it was private property and that Ione's use of it for demonstrations constituted commercial traffic on a residential right-of-way. The road was not legally private. It was an informal route used by the valley for decades. But Merritt was large, and his ranch hands followed his orders, and a blocked road was a blocked road regardless of who had the right to open it. 3 families who had planned to attend Ione's second demonstration turned back when they found a ranch wagon parked across the track and a hired man sitting on the seat with a rifle across his knees. The hired man was not threatening anyone. He was not pointing the weapon. He was simply present, and his presence communicated what Merritt wanted it to communicate. This road belongs to the family that owns the land beside it, and the family's head does not want you to pass. Jenkin watched the obstruction from Ione's ridge and said nothing for a long time. His cough had worsened. It came in fits now, deep, wrenching spasms that bent him forward and left him winded. He blamed the cold air. Ione looked at the cloth he coughed into and said nothing about what she saw there, because saying it would not change it, and Jenkin did not want it said. They sat together at the table on a February evening. The stove burned at 29 pounds per day, back to the single occupancy rate, steady and quiet. The cabin was 65 degrees. Outside, the temperature hovered near 0, and the stars were visible through the high ventilation gap, cold and bright and indifferent. "You cannot fight him on the road," Jenkins said. "He owns the land beside it, and he has men, and you do not." "I know. You can go around. Mina's track joins the county road below the ranch gate. It adds 2 miles, but it avoids his property." "I know that too." Jenkin looked at the stove. He reached into his vest and produced a brass key, small, tarnished, with a squared shaft and a simple bit. It was a stove key, the kind used to adjust a damper or open a draft valve, and it was old enough that the brass had worn smooth from decades of handling. "I carried this from my first Colorado camp," he said. "Laddville, 1872. The foreman gave it to me when I built my first ventilation door. He said it was for luck. I used it for the damper on the bunkhouse stove and never lost it." He set the key on the table between them. "I'm going to Pueblo," he said. "My daughter has asked. My lungs are not improving. The altitude is part of the reason, and the cold is the rest." Ione looked at the key. She did not pick it up. "When?" "When the road holds a wagon. March, perhaps." "You will come back." "I do not think so. Not to stay." The cabin was quiet. The stove ticked. Coal settled in the firebox with a sound like a whispered syllable in a language that only heat understood. "A sound system is one another person can use when you are gone," Jenkins said. "That is what your mother built. That is what you have learned. Do not hide it the way she had to hide it. She hid the coal because she had no choice. You have a choice." Ione picked up the key. It was warm from his hand. She hung it on a nail beside the stove, next to Martha's tin coal measure. The brass caught the firelight and held it, a small, steady glow beside the larger glow of the iron, 2 sources of warmth from 2 people who had seen what cold could do and had chosen to answer it with precision instead of prayer. Jenkin left in the 2nd week of March, when the road had dried enough for a wagon. Ione walked with him to the county road. He climbed onto the seat slowly, protecting his bad leg and his worse lungs, and he did not look back as the wagon moved south toward the lower valley. He was not a man who looked back. He was a man who built things correctly and trusted them to stand after he left the room. Ione walked home alone. The stove was burning when she returned. She checked the draft, cleared the ash, and recorded the temperature. 64 degrees. The ledger entry for that day was the same as every other day: numbers, measurements, precision. Except that the hand that wrote it paused twice, and the second pause left a small ink mark on the page that looked like nothing and meant everything. The secondary crisis came in February of the following year, 1888, and it came without warning because crises do not believe in schedules. A slide on the narrow gauge trestle between Crested Butte and Gunnison delayed regular coal and supply deliveries for 9 days. On the third day of the delay, a boarding house chimney cracked. Not Olson's, but a newer house on the east side of town where a mining supervisor named Clute had built a 2-story structure with 3 stoves and a chimney that shared a wall thimble with a load-bearing timber. The crack was not dramatic. It was a 3-inch separation in the brick above the roofline, invisible from inside, that allowed wind to enter the flue and disrupt the draft. The disrupted draft pushed smoke into the wall cavity. The wall cavity, lined with dry pine, began to smolder.